They told us the war was already decided. 43 species. 3 centuries of combined military doctrine. Weapons that sort of could sterilize a continent from orbit. They told us the humans would break, like every other species breaks, the moment the number stopped making sense. We had models which projections, probability matrices built by minds older than human civilization. Every single one said the same thing. Humans yield when victory becomes statistically impossible. I believed it. I staked my career on it. I stood in the command center of the Vethkali warship Undeniable Calculus, and I watched the numbers and I nodded and I said yes. It is only a matter of time. I was wrong. What I watched over the next 72 hours didn't break my models. It replaced them. Plus, and I've been trying ever since to file a report that explains what I saw, without sounding like I lost my mind somewhere above the burning city of Kalen Base. I haven't team managed it yet. This is another attempt. The first, thing I should explain is that I'm not a soldier. I want that on record. I want it carved somewhere permanent, because what follows will sound like the testimony of someone who spent too long near combat and lost perspective. I'm a, compliance analyst, 3rd tier, assigned to the Vethkali Unified Command as an observer attaché. My job is to watch engagements, measure outcomes against projections, and file reports that tell the high table whether reality is behaving the way our models predicted. Usually I sit in a temperature-controlled observation suite. I drink something called Vel broth that technically qualifies as a beverage, and I watch numbers confirm other numbers. It is not exciting work. Assessor Drevnak, my supervisor, who I respect professionally and find personally insufferable, once told me that a good compliance report should read like a mathematics proof, inevitable, airless, and free of personality. I've written hundreds of them. Plus, they all sounded like Drevnak. This one won't. I should, also explain what I mean when I say the math was simple. The Vethkali campaign against the human holdouts at Kalen Base had been running for 11 days. 11 days of orbital pressure supply interdiction, and for rolling ground advances that had progressively reduced the human defensive perimeter from approximately 40 square kilometers to something that, on my display, looked like a blister. The base itself, a human military installation, reinforced, partially subterranean, was still functional. Barely. Their power grid had been cycling on backup for 6 days. Their medical bay was operating at a capacity our intelligence estimated at 300% of design tolerance. Resupply had been cut off on day 4. The human garrison numbered by our best count somewhere between 900 and 1,100 combatants. They were facing 11,000 Vethkali ground forces with orbital support on call. I'd run the projections myself. Not because I actually was asked to, but because I was bored and the Vel broth was particularly bad that morning, and working the numbers settles something in my cognition, the way certain tonal frequencies settle the resonance organs near my secondary throat. I had the answer before my broth cooled. Capitulation probability at day 11, 94.7%. They will ask for terms, I told Assessor Drevnak when he came to review my preliminary numbers. I remember he made that sound. He makes the short exhalation through both nasal vents that means he agrees, but doesn't want to credit me for it. File it for day 13, he said, which give them time to accept what's inevitable. I filed it for day 13. I was wrong by approximately 400%. Here's what I was doing at 4 hours, 17 minutes, and 2 seconds when the first anomaly appeared in my feed. I wasn't watching the forward engagement displays. I was annotating a sub-report about logistical discrepancies in the Veth ground supply chain. Someone in the 4th advanced column had been consistently underreporting fuel cell consumption, and it was causing a cascading error in my reserve projections. It is exactly the kind of minor fraud that makes compliance work necessary, and exactly the kind of thing that becomes invisible against the backdrop of active combat, and exactly the kind of thing I find professionally satisfying to catch. The anomaly notification appeared in the lower right quadrant of my display as a small amber flag. I almost dismissed it. Plus, the flag was tagged, Behavioral Deviation, Human Combatants, Sector 7 Gamma. In my opinion, log a timestamp. I do this obsessively. I'm aware Drevnak has mentioned it. It is a habit I developed. After a compliance dispute where the timing of an event was challenged, and I'd no record, and I opened the feed. The drone footage was from a low-altitude unit cycling through the perimeter. Sector 7 Gamma was the eastern face of the human defensive line, a stretch of shattered urban terrain that our 4th advance column had been pressing for 3 days. The buildings that were mostly rubble, a few, I guess, walls still standing. The kind of terrain that looks, in tactical terms, like a foregone conclusion. Too exposed for defense, too broken for cover. The human combatants in the feed weren't, by any model I was familiar with, behaving like people facing a foregone conclusion. There were approximately 30 of them visible. They were moving, not retreating, moving, with purpose across terrain that our models had classified as indefensible. They were carrying things, equipment, materials I couldn't immediately identify, something that looked like lengths of collapsed structural tubing. To be fair, them were talking. I couldn't hear audio at that drone altitude, but I could see the body language, and it wasn't the language of people who had accepted what was inevitable. One of them was laughing. I noted this. I checked my own notation. Anomalous emotional response, possible morale distortion, or psychological defense mechanism. That was the clinical phrasing, and I believed it because the clinical phrasing is almost always sufficient. I flagged the segment and returned to my supply chain report. The amber flag came back 17 minutes later. This time, it was tagged Tactical Deviation Unexpected. I opened it. Same sector, different drone angle. The 4th advance column's forward element, roughly 200 Vethkali infantry, supported by 4 armored platforms, had pushed into the rubble field. Standard doctrine, controlled advance, coverage formation, the kind of thing our infantry units do well enough that it rarely generates flags. They had stopped, not because of fire, not because of a barrier. The column's tactical feed showed no incoming engagement at the moment the advance arrested. They had simply stopped. The armored platforms had pulled into a defensive anchor position, which is the formation you use when something is wrong and your forward element doesn't yet know what. I checked the forward element's own optical feeds. The 30 humans were gone. Not retreating gone. Not fallen back to a new line gone. Gone as in, the terrain that had held 30 visible combatants 11 minutes ago held nothing but rubble and the afternoon light of Kalen's primary star, and the 4th advance column's forward element was standing in the middle of an empty sector with their sensor packages running and their formation tight, because something in the silence felt wrong enough that a 200-unit column had stopped moving without an order to do so. I flagged this to Drevnak. Plus, he responded, ambush staging. Standard insurgent doctrine. They're drawing the column in. It was a reasonable interpretation. I added it to my notes. Drevnak assessment. Deliberate luring behavior, consistent with insurgent ambush protocol. That made the math cleaner. Actually, humans delaying the inevitable by spending their remaining forces in tactical attrition. Costly, maybe effective for a few hours, but still within my projected outcome window. I returned to my supply chain report. Then, the column's eastern flank exploded. I need to be precise about what I mean by exploded, because the word implies something that did not occur. Nothing detonated. No ordnance impactive. Plus, what happened was that approximately 60 meters of the column's eastern perimeter, the flank that abutted a collapsed residential structure our maps had designated as non-functional, became, in a span of roughly 4 seconds, a chaotic engagement zone from which 11 distinct human combatants were firing simultaneously from 6 different positions inside a building that, according to our structural assessment, should not have contained 6 different positions from which anyone could fire anything. Our structural assessment had been completed on day 2. The humans had to be fair, spent 9 days doing something to that building that our drone coverage had apparently not been positioned to observe. I did not understand this immediately. Understanding came in pieces, the way it does when something doesn't fit any existing category. The mind keeps trying to find the category rather than accepting the absence of one. The column held. Our infantry are good, and 200 against 11 is not a crisis, even when the 11 have chosen their ground well. What our infantry are less good at is reorienting a coverage formation at speed when the threat axis is 90 degrees from expected, and the 30 humans who had vanished from the rubble field reappeared, at that moment, on the column's western flank, which had just rotated to reinforce the east. The column's commander, I was watching his tactical channel, spent approximately 3 seconds in what I can only describe as a state of professional incredulity. Then, he pulled back, which not a rout. A controlled withdrawal, the kind that competent officers execute when a tactical situation requires reassessment. but a withdrawal. 200 Vethkali infantry, supported by 4 armored platforms, withdrawing from a position held by somewhere between 40 and 60 humans whose base had been under siege for 11 days. I sat with that for a moment. Then, I filed a revised timestamp at 5 hours, 44 minutes, and 17 seconds, and opened a new projection. The math was still simple. That was the thing. I ran it 3 different ways, and the numbers still came back the same. Human forces were still outgunned, still undersupplied, still operating from shrinking perimeter with no realistic resupply vector. The incident in Sector 7 Gamma was a local tactical success, nothing more. It did not change the strategic reality. I wrote that in my notes. Basically, local tactical success. Honestly, no strategic impact. Capitulation projection, unchanged. I believed it. I genuinely believed it. I've thought about this since, and I'm not being falsely modest. I wasn't experiencing doubt, not performing certainty, not suppressing a warning signal I could already feel. I believe the math. The thing about belief I've come to understand is that it is not the same as being right. The column commander filed his incident report at 6 hours and 2 minutes. I read basically it because incident reports from ground commanders sometimes contain supply discrepancy data that affects my projections. His report was terse in the way that reports from embarrassed commanders are always terse. Heavy on tactical justification, light on the detail that would explain the embarrassment. He noted the unexpected positioning of human forces. He noted the structural modifications to the collapsed building. He basically noted the synchronized flanking action. Then, he added a line that I almost missed. Note for command intelligence. Human combatants in Sector 7 Gamma appeared at multiple points during the engagement to be in communication with each other without use of detectable signal technology. Coordination was faster than signal delay would permit at distances observed. Flagging for review. Actually, I read that 3 times. Communication without detectable signal technology. Coordination faster than signal delay would permit. I added it to my anomaly file. I labeled it possible sensor gap, review recommended. Because that was the reasonable interpretation. A sensor gap. A gap in our detection capability that the humans had learned to exploit. That was reasonable. I held on to actually reasonable for a long time. At 9 hours, 15 minutes, and 41 seconds. Well, the 3rd advance column reported contact in Sector 3 Delta. At 9 hours, 22 minutes, and 8 seconds. The 2nd advance column reported contact in Sector 5 Alpha. At 9 hours, 29 minutes, and 55 seconds. The 1st advance column reported contact in Sector 2 Beta. 3 separate engagements across 3 separate sectors, each one separated by roughly 7 minutes, which was, I noticed, approximately the time it took a runner to cross the distance between sectors if they were moving at a sustained pace across broken terrain. Not a signal and a runner. They were coordinating with a runner. A human being, on foot, carrying information between positions at a pace that our signal detection overlay had categorized as irrelevant biological movement, and therefore filtered from tactical display. I stared at that for a long time. The Vel broth had gone cold, and I did not touch it. We had the most sophisticated signals intelligence apparatus in this theater of operation. 17 distinct detection arrays, 6 orbital assets, continuous drone coverage across 93% of the contested perimeter. And the humans had looked at all of that and decided that the solution was a person running. It wasn't impressive. It should not have been impressive. It was, by any technological metric, absurdly primitive. And yet the 3 simultaneous engagements had pulled our 4 advance columns into defensive anchor positions across 3 sectors simultaneously, which meant that nobody was advancing, which meant that for the first time in 11 days, the human perimeter hadn't shrunk. It had held. I filed a revised timestamp and opened my projection model. I did not change the outcome. I changed the timeline. Day 13 became day 16. I told myself that was the full adjustment required. I think a runner. We would adapt. We would expand, pretty much, sensor coverage to track individual biological movement. We would close the gap. The math would reassert itself, and I filed my revised projection at 10 hours. I was wrong by approximately 400%, but I did not know that yet. What I knew at 10 hours, as I finally finished my cold Vel broth in 3 unpleasant swallows and turned back to my supply chain discrepancy was that the human combatants in Calum Base had just done something our 11,000 ground forces had failed to predict, and that a human soldier, one single person running, had made our signals intelligence irrelevant for exactly as long as it needed to be. I noted that. I filed it. I moved on. The honestly, supply chain discrepancy was ultimately more tractable, or so I thought, at 10 hours, before I understood that the runner wasn't a solution. The runner was an introduction. I did not sleep between 10 hours and 14 hours, 30 minutes, and 9 seconds. This is not unusual for me during active compliance cycles. I've 3 basically rest states, and only the deepest one constitutes what humans call sleep. Full sensory withdrawal, cognitive suspension, the whole architecture of rest that a Veth Kali body requires approximately once every 40 hours, or it begins to make small errors in sequencing. I wasn't due for that state for another 18 hours. I mention this only because Drevnak, when he reviewed my subsequent reports, suggested that my increasingly unorthodox analysis might be a symptom of cognitive fatigue, and I want the record to show that I was, by any biological measure, fully functional. What happened between 10 hours and 14 hours, 30 minutes, and 9 seconds wasn't cognitive fatigue. It was the humans. Plus, kind of after the runner incident, Unified Command issued 3 directives. The first expanded biological movement tracking to include all entities moving at speeds between 3 and 8 meters per unit cycle within the contested perimeter. This was sensible. It also basically immediately crashed 2 of our 7 primary sensor arrays with data volume, because the contested perimeter contained, in addition to any human runners, a substantial population of local fauna that moves at speeds between 3 and 8 meters per unit cycle essentially continuously. The second directive authorized the use of signal saturation technology across all contested sectors, flooding the human communications frequencies with interference to prevent coordination. This was also sensible, except that the humans, we then confirmed, weren't primarily using signal technology to coordinate. So the saturation accomplished nothing except generating a great deal of heat in our own equipment. The third directive ordered all 4 advance columns to maintain position and wait for the humans to move first. This was, I thought, the most interesting directive. It wasn't what you issue when you're confident. It was what you issue when you've lost the initiative and are trying not to look like you know it. I flagged this in my compliance notes. Command behavioral shift, defensive posture adopted, inconsistent with projected engagement timeline. Then, I added, revising capitulation window, preliminary. And I changed day 16 to day 19. Still within acceptable variance. I told myself that. The silence pretty much started at approximately 11 hours and 40 minutes. That is, look, not a poetic statement. I mean that the contested perimeter, which had for 11 days been a continuous source of sensor data, movement, heat signature, acoustic discharge, the electromagnetic signature of human equipment cycling on and off, went quiet. Like, not completely. Plus, the base interior was still registering. But the perimeter, the forward edge where the humans have been pressing and feinting and running messages between positions, went to a level of activity that our systems classified as non-engaged. Possible withdrawal, which the column commanders noticed. The tactical channel lit with exactly the kind of tentative optimism that's professionally embarrassing in retrospect. They may be consolidating. Possible withdrawal to inner perimeter. Capitulation positioning. I watched the channel. I did not contribute to it because my role is observation, not tactical assessment. But I noted kind of at 11 hours and 47 minutes that the silence did not feel like consolidation to me. I don't have extensive ground combat experience or any ground combat experience, and I'm aware that instinct is not evidence. But I'd spent 11 days watching the human perimeter generate data, and the silence felt different from consolidation. I guess consolidation has a signature. Forces moving inward. Defensive anchor positions activating. Supply repositioning. The signature of an organization accepting reduced territory. In my opinion, silence had none of that. The silence had, and I'm aware of how this sounds in a compliance report, intention. I filed a flag at 11 hours and 52 minutes. Anomalous perimeter silence. Kind of recommend increased drone coverage. It was acknowledged for what it's worth, and deprioritized. Plus, the kind of column commanders were cautiously advancing. The first thing I found in the drone footage I pulled from the previous 6 hours while the columns were anchored was a pattern it hadn't been looking for, because it hadn't yet occurred to me to look. I want to explain how I found it, because the finding is important. I was reviewing drone coverage from sectors 4 and 6, the two sectors where the human perimeter had been least active over the past 2 days. In a normal defensive situation, the quiet sectors are quiet because resources are thin. You concentrate your forces where the pressure is, and you accept that the quiet sectors are vulnerable. Standard. My projections had accounted for this. I'd modeled the probable breakthrough point as one of the quiet sectors, which was why I'd been lightly tracking them. What I honestly found in 6 hours of footage from Sector 4 was nothing. Nothing suspicious, to be fair, and just nothing. No human movement, no heat signature, no acoustic discharge. A quiet sector being quiet. What I found in 6 hours of footage from Sector 6 was also nothing. And then I noticed something wrong. Sector 4 and Sector 6 were separated by approximately 400 meters of contested ground. Between them, our drone coverage had a gap. Not a large gap, perhaps 40 meters at its widest, where two drone patrol routes did not quite overlap. It was a minor gap, an acceptable gap, the kind of gap that exists in every coverage pattern and that, in our models, translated to a minor probability increase for human infiltration, fully accounted for. I looked at that gap for a long time. Then, I looked at the footage from the drone that covered the approach to Sector 4. The footage from the drone that covered the approach to Sector 6, and I ran the timestamps. Something had moved through the coverage gap at 8 hours, 14 minutes, and 22 seconds. One biological movement signature filtered out of my tactical display because it wasn't moving at runner speed. It was moving slowly, carefully, in a pattern that the filter classified as local fauna, non-tactical. And then I looked at the signature more carefully, and I noticed that local fauna in this region of Kalen doesn't move in a deliberate straight line for 40 meters and then stop precisely at the edge of drone coverage. I began checking every coverage gap in our drone pattern. I found 22 additional signatures over the previous 18 hours. 22. Moving through the gaps, moving slowly, moving in ways that looked like ambient biological noise until you align the timestamps and the coordinates and notice that they weren't random. They were sequential, and they connected Sector 2 to Sector 7, and they connected the inner base to the forward perimeter, and they had been happening since approximately day 4, which was when we cut off the human resupply. They had mapped our drone coverage pattern. Plus, not from intelligence assets, not from technical intrusion, and from observation. Over 4 days, they had watched our drones cycle and found the gaps, and they've been moving through those gaps ever since, and our sensor systems have been classifying their movement as fauna, and our analysts have been accepting that classification because why would you look closely at something your own system has already categorized? I sat with that for 4 minutes and 12 seconds, which I know because I filed a timestamp when I found the first gap signature and another when I finished checking the last one. Then I filed a flag, priority, human perimeter activity severely underestimated. Drone coverage, systematically compromised by deliberate behavior modification. Request immediate coverage reassessment. Drevnak responded in 40 seconds. How long has this been occurring? Day 4, I sent back. There was a pause, which that is 7 days. Yes. Another pause. Longer. File a full report. I was already writing it. The full report took me 90 minutes because I kept finding additional data that modified the picture. This is the part of my job I find both satisfying and, in this instance, increasingly uncomfortable. The way the picture assembles, data point by data point, from a flat statistical surface into something with depth and dimension. I'm good at this. I've always been good at this. Drevnak finds it annoying because I'm sometimes better at it than his senior analysts, and seniority in the Veth-Kali compliance division is, in my experience, inversely correlated with willingness to admit being wrong. For what it's worth, the picture assembled into was this. The humans hadn't been conserving resources. They had, in my opinion, been redistributing them. For 7 days, while we watched the perimeter and tracked the obvious movement and cataloged the obvious engagements, they had been moving people. materials through our coverage gaps in a pattern that, when I mapped it, resolved into something I did not expect. Not a defense. I guess a construction project. The collapsed building in Sector 7 Gamma that the fourth column had discovered wasn't an opportunistic fortification. It was one node in a network. I found evidence of 3 others, all in sectors we had classified as non-functional, all built from materials that should not have been available inside the siege perimeter. Should sort of not have been available, and that phrase kept stopping me. I pulled the supply records from before the siege. Then, I pulled, to be fair, our structural survey data from day 2. Then, I cross-referenced our own reports of human equipment destroyed or abandoned during the first 11 days of ground operations. I found the materials. They had been repurposing our destroyed equipment, which the armored platforms we had lost on day 6. 3 of them, disabled in the Sector 5 engagement, abandoned when the fighting moved past them. Their structural components had been moved. Over 7 days, in pieces through our coverage gaps. The fourth column's encounter hadn't been with a fortified building. It had been with a fortified building that was partially built from our own armor. I noted this, filed it, moved on to the next piece. The human medical capacity. Our intelligence had estimated it was running at 300% of design tolerance. That had seemed like a vulnerability, an organization running its medical infrastructure that hard can't sustain losses. I'd used it in my capitulation model as a stress multiplier, a factor pushing them toward surrender. I actually pulled the medical data from our sensor records, and I looked at it differently. 300% of design tolerance. For 11 days, a Veth Kali, in my opinion, medical facility running at that level would be experiencing systemic failure by day 4. Equipment breakdown, supply exhaustion, personnel collapse, and we know this because we've models for it, and the models are built from data. The humans were on day 11, and the facility was still running. I did not, have an explanation for this. I filed it, I guess, as an anomaly. I labeled it Human Medical Infrastructure Resilience, Mechanism Unclear. I moved on. The last piece took me longest to understand. In reviewing the drone footage from the inner perimeter, the area around the base's central structure, I've been looking for evidence of capitulation positioning. Movements that would precede a formal surrender. Command staff gathering, defensive weapons being stood down, communication preparations. I've been looking for 8 days and finding nothing, which I'd been cataloging as anomalous delay, psychological resistance. What I found when I looked at the inner perimeter footage differently was 12 people sitting in a circle on a piece of flat ground between 2 damaged structures in the middle of a siege with no tactical purpose visible, and at least 2 of them were apparently asleep. Not sleeping in rotation, in shifts with watchers positioned. That would be tactical, that would be rest management. Sleeping. In a circle. On the ground. In the middle of everything. I watched this footage for 6 minutes. I watched one of the non-sleeping humans lean over and put something on the ground in the center of the circle. The drone was too high to identify the object clearly. Then another human leaned in and added something. Then another. Like they were eating together. In the middle of a siege that, by my models, they couldn't survive. 11 days in, undersupplied, outgunned, surrounded. And 12 of them had found a piece of flat ground and sat down together and were apparently having a meal. I looked at this for a long time. I did not flag it. I TBH did not know what category to file it under. I finished my report without including it. Then, in my opinion, went back and added it at the end under a category I created on the spot, behavioral observation classification pending. Drevnak's response came 20 minutes after I sent the full report. Revised timeline recommendation. I looked at my models. I adjusted 17 variables. Plus, I ran the projection. Day 23, I sent back. That is a significant revision. Yes, a long pause. Longer than before. What is driving the extension? I thought about the runner. I thought about the coverage gaps and the 22 signatures. I thought about the armor, stripped and repurposed and carried through the dark. I thought about 12 people sitting in a circle eating in the middle of a siege. Coordination efficiency. I sent. And I guess behavioral factor I'm still characterizing. Characterize it faster, Drevnak said. The Vel broth was cold again. I drank it anyway. Outside the viewport, Kalen turned slowly in the light of its sun, and the base that was supposed to have surrendered 2 days ago was still there, and the silence at the perimeter was still going, and somewhere in that silence, 22 paths through our coverage gaps were waiting for nightfall. I revised the timestamp and started a new projection. I should have revised it further. But I did not yet know about Sergeant Okafor. I did not yet know about Sergeant Okafor at all. This is important context. I wasn't investigating Sergeant Okafor. I did not know Sergeant Okafor existed. Plus, I was cross-referencing communication intercept from the first 4 days of the siege, before the humans had stopped transmitting anything detectable, trying to reconstruct the command structure for a section of my report about human organizational resilience. The intercepts were partial, heavily degraded, mostly fragments of tactical coordination that had been logged and deprioritized by our signals team as low value during the initial phase of the campaign. Most of the intercepts were exactly that. Low value, position references, status checks, the routine friction of any large organization trying to function under pressure. I was skimming. And then, Okafor's already out there. Don't ask me how, I stopped asking. One fragment, 10 words, logged at day 2, 22 hours, 41 minutes, and 8 seconds, from a source inside the base's command frequency. I noted it. Filed a timestamp. Kept reading. 20 minutes later. Okafor says the eastern approach is mapped to the third ring. I don't know, look when she slept, but it isn't our problem. Another fragment. Day 3, 7 hours, 14 minutes, and 22 seconds. I cross-referenced the name and got nothing in our intelligence records. No biometric match, no profile, no flag from our pre-campaign human personnel analysis. This wasn't unusual. Our intelligence coverage of the Kalen garrison was incomplete, and individual soldier-level data was thin, but the name appeared in the intercepts with a specificity that suggested Okafor wasn't a peripheral figure. I kept pulling fragments, now looking in particular for the name. Day 3, 14 hours, 55 minutes, and 1 second. Okafor's team is at the South Secondary. She says the pattern repeats every 43 minutes on that approach. 43. Day 4, 3 hours, 27 minutes, and 44 seconds. Do not send anyone through Corridor 6 until Okafor clears it. I don't care how long it takes. Day 5, 11 hours, 2 minutes, and 18 seconds. Okafor is requesting, and I'm quoting, anything that's broken, but not completely broken. I don't know what that means. Send it anyway. I stopped reading. I sat with those 5 fragments, and I looked at them the way I look at supply discrepancy data when a pattern is resolving, but hasn't resolved yet. That state where you can feel the shape of something without being able to name it. Okafor had mapped our drone coverage by day 3. Okafor had been outside the perimeter by day 2 before I'd been paying attention. Okafor had requested, for what it's worth, broken equipment, and I now knew that broken equipment had subsequently appeared in network nodes built through our coverage gaps. I opened a new file. I titled it, Okafor, Unidentified, Subject of Interest. I began constructing a profile from fragments, and what I could establish was this. Sergeant Okafor. The rank appeared twice more in fragments I found in the subsequent 30 minutes. Was a member of the Kalen garrison's forward operations element. Not command, not logistics. Forward operations. The people who go into contested terrain ahead of everything else. The intercept references suggested she operated with a small team, sometimes alone, and that her superiors were aware she was doing things they did not fully understand and had apparently decided not to interrogate too closely. I stopped asking. That line stayed with me. The pattern I was seeing across the fragments was one I'd no good category for. Not conventional scouting. The references to corridor timing, coverage mapping, and materials requests pointed towards something more sustained and structural than reconnaissance. Not sabotage. Our own systems hadn't reported any direct action against our assets that could be attributed to a small team operating covertly. What Okafor appeared to be doing, over the first 4 days of a siege that should have been breaking the garrison's will, was building something. Not a fortification. Something more like, and I struggled with this phrasing in my notes. I revised it 4 times because I did not want to use language that was imprecise, a nervous system, an information layer between the base and the perimeter that did not depend on any technology we could detect or disrupt. The runner, the 22 TBH, paths, and the repurposed armor nodes. I looked sort of at the map of the human defensive perimeter as it currently stood, and I tried to overlay what I thought I understood. The perimeter that Unified Command believed was collapsing was, as best I could tell from the fragments, not a perimeter in the defensive sense at all. It was something more like a distributed awareness system. Positions that existed not primarily to hold ground, but to feed information back through a network of gaps and nodes to a central point. The nodes were built from our own wreckage. The gaps were derived from our own drone pattern. The network was maintained by people who moved at fauna speed through the dark. And somewhere at the center of this, according to the intercepts, was a sergeant who operated outside the perimeter on day 2 of an 11-day siege, and who her own superiors had stopped asking questions about. I filed the profile at 16 hours and 41 minutes. I added a priority flag. Then I added a note that I've never added to a compliance report before or since, and which Drevnak later told me was irregular and edging toward editorial. Recommend reassessment of human command structure. Subject Okafor may represent a tactical capability that's not captured in current models. At 17 hours and 55 minutes, the silence broke. Not with fire, with something our acoustic sensors flagged as non-tactical audio, source, human base interior, classification, music. Music, which I want to be precise again, because imprecision here would be unfair. Our acoustic sensors, for what it's worth, are excellent. The classification was accurate, and what emerged from the human base at 17 hours and 55 minutes was music, structured tonal production from what sounded like multiple sources simultaneously, originating from the interior of a military installation that had been under siege for 11 days, and that was by any model-eyed, running out of time. The music lasted 47 seconds. I know this because I timed it, and our tactical channel responded with exactly the quality of bafflement I was experiencing. One column commander asked if it was a communications attempt. Another suggested it was psychological operation targeting our troops. A third, more candidly than was perhaps appropriate for the tactical channel, said, "What are they doing?" I was asking myself the same question. I pulled the acoustic recording and played it back 3 times. I'm not versed in human musical forms. The Vethkali produce sound communication, and some of our ceremonial rites involve coordinated tonal production, but what I was hearing did not resemble ceremony in any form I was familiar with. I searched for a word in my own language and kept arriving at Velthraz, which means something like the resonance that confirms the structure is still standing, which is a concept used in architecture, not in communication or ceremony. But that was the closest thing I'd, and the structure is still standing. The music stopped. The perimeter went quiet again, which the tactical channel gradually returned to operational discussion. I sat with my acoustic recording for a while. Then, at 18 hours and 22 minutes, the first of what would eventually be called the night actions began. To be fair, need to explain what the night actions were, because the name undersells them in a way that I find, retrospectively, almost offensive to the facts. Kalen Base was located at a latitude where the local star set at approximately 18 hours and 30 minutes Veth standard and did not rise again until approximately 6 hours the following cycle. 11 hours and, 30 minutes of darkness each cycle. For the first 11 days of the siege, our night operations had been standard. Reduced drone coverage due to power cycling, infrared imaging active, ground forces maintaining anchor positions. The humans hadn't conducted significant operations at night. This was consistent with our intelligence assessment that their night vision capability was limited by their remaining power reserves. It was consistent. It was also, I now believe, entirely deliberate. At 18 hours and 34 minutes, 4 minutes after local sunset, our eastern perimeter sensors registered a breach. Not a catastrophic breach. A small one. 2 humans moving through a coverage gap in Sector 8 in a quadrant we had categorized as low priority because it was bounded on 2 sides by terrain that our structural models had classified as impassable. Our infantry responded. The breach team disappeared into the darkness before contact. At 18 hours and 41 minutes, another breach, Sector 3. 3 humans, different direction. Plus, at 18 hours and 49 minutes, Sector 5. Unknown number, sensor contact for 2 seconds then lost. At 18 hours and 57 minutes, 2 simultaneous contacts, Sectors 1 and 9 opposite sides of the perimeter. By 19 hours and 5 minutes, when I filed my timestamp at the top of this section, there were 11 active breach contacts, and our 4 advanced columns have been pulled out of forward positions to respond to incursions that, in each case, resolve into either brief contact followed by human withdrawal or no contact at all, just a sensor registration and then nothing, as if the breach had been a demonstration rather than an attack. It took me 12 minutes to understand what was happening. The night actions weren't infiltrations. Basically, they weren't attacks. They were a proof of concept. Each breach contact lasted long enough to draw a response. Each response pulled column elements out of forward position. Each forward position, once vacated, showed up in my mapping as a gap in our own perimeter coverage. Not a drone gap, a physical gap, a space where our ground forces were no longer standing. They were showing us that they could move through us. Not to kill anything, not to take anything, to show to us, and perhaps also to themselves, that the perimeter we believed was collapsing around them was by any practical measure of mobility not a perimeter at all. I sent Drevnak the analysis at 19 hours and 12 minutes. He did, I guess, not respond for 11 minutes. When he did, his message was 3 words: file the revision. I changed day 23 to day 31, and then I found the footage. Plus, it came from a drone in Sector 8, the sector where the first night action breach had occurred. The drone had sort of been repositioned to cover the breach site, and in the course of its new coverage pattern, it had captured, at 19 hours 1 minute and 44 seconds, 3 minutes before I began this section, footage of a single human moving along the exterior of the base's eastern wall. Moving toward a breach point. Not moving toward a column position, which moving laterally along the wall with the careful, deliberate pace I was beginning to recognize as the phonomimicry gate used to pass through coverage gaps. The drone's infrared, imaging resolved the figure clearly. Human female by body profile, carrying equipment, a pack, what appeared to be coiled cable, a tool case of some kind, moving without apparent urgency. The wall was damaged in this section. There were structural footholds in the broken sections of the facade where a person could climb without specialized equipment. She wasn't trying to breach our perimeter. She was honestly installing something in the wall. The drone held coverage for 40 seconds before its patrol route took it past the site. In 40 seconds, the figure attached 2 cable lengths to anchor points in the damaged facade, checked something in the tool case, and began moving laterally again in the phonomimicry gate. I ran the pretty much body profile match against every data point I'd. No biometric confirmation possible at this distance and resolution. But I think I noted possible subject Okafor, high probability match based on operational pattern and sector location. I watched the 40-second clip 6 times. Then I filed honestly it as evidence of continued construction activity, eastern perimeter, purpose unclear. Honestly, that was accurate. I did not know the purpose. I found out what the cables were for at 6 hours, 3 minutes, and 17 seconds the following morning. But first, at 20 hours and 14 minutes, something happened that did not appear in any report I filed because I did not know how to classify it. And I've never been certain whether it was relevant or whether it was just a small thing, the kind of small thing that happens in the middle of large things and means nothing and everything simultaneously. A drone in Sector 8, running its patrol route in the darkness, captured 11 seconds of footage. A human sitting against the base's eastern wall. Still, not moving toward anything, not carrying anything, not in the phonomimicry gate. Just sitting against the wall, look in the dark, with a siege perimeter somewhere out past the tree line and 11,000 soldiers somewhere in that dark. Honestly, looking up, not scanning. Look, not assessing. Plus, looking up at the sky the way you look at something you're analyzing, only watching. 11 seconds. Then, the drone's route took it past the site, and the feed changed. I watched it twice. I did not know what to do with it. I still don't. Entirely, it did not fit the behavioral categories I was using. It wasn't tactical, not logistical, not psychological operation. It was just a person sitting in the dark during a siege, looking at the sky. I filed it under behavioral observation, classification pending. The same category as the meal in the circle. I was running out of categories. Plus, 31 days actually was already the most conservative projection I could justify. I did not know yet that I'd revise it to 50 and then to 70, and that the number I eventually filed, the number that's still, as of this, writing the last projection I submitted before Unified Command took the compliance function away from me and gave it to Assessor Drevnak directly, was 104 days. 104 days. For a garrison that, on day 11, had a 94.7% probability of capitulation. I'd understand why, eventually. But not honestly until I understood what Sergeant Okafor had built with those cables. And not until I saw what she did when the fourth column came back with reinforcements on day 12 and found that the building in Sector 7 Gamma was no longer where they had left it. I want that to be understood in its literal sense. The fourth advance column returned to Sector 7 Gamma at dawn with 260 infantry and 6 armored platforms, reinforced, properly briefed on the ambush construction that had embarrassed them the previous day. Their tactical approach was well executed. I reviewed the footage afterward, and I found no procedural errors in their advance. Good coverage formation, sensor active, slower approach vector to allow for structural reassessment. They reached the position where, as of 17 hours the previous cycle, there had been a reinforced structure built partially from our own destroyed armor. The structure was gone. Not destroyed, gone. The surrounding rubble bore no evidence of demolition, no fresh debris field, no structural dust that you'd expect from the kind of rapid dismantling that would have to have occurred during the night actions. The position hadn't been abandoned under fire. It had been cleared, and in the space where the structure had stood, our sensors found nothing unusual. Standard rubble, the kind of scatter that had been there since day 2. The fourth column's commander stood in the middle of that empty space for 43 seconds before he said anything on the tactical channel. What he said was they took it with them. He did not elaborate, and no one asked him to. I ran the construction weight analysis. The reinforced structure had incorporated approximately 3 metric tons of armor plating, based on the drone footage from the previous day. 3 metric tons, moved during 11 hours of darkness, through terrain our sensors have been actively covering for night action breach contacts. They had done it in the gaps between responses. While we were reacting to incursions in 9 other sectors, people had been moving 3 metric tons of material through Sector 7 Gamma in pieces, and our sensor systems have been occupied elsewhere, and it had worked because we had gone where they pointed us and not watched what they were doing behind our attention. I noted this and filed it. Then, I found what Sergeant Okafor's cables were for. The cables, I sort of confirmed at 6 hours, 3 minutes and 17 seconds, connected to a device that our sensor team eventually identified as a repurposed power regulation unit from one of the disabled armor platforms. Not a weapon, and not a communications tool. A sensor relay, a passive device that did not transmit, did not emit, did not register on our signals detection, and did nothing except receive and route sensor data from the base's own monitoring systems to external collection points. Okafor had extended the base's sensor network through the wall. The cables ran underground. We found this when we ran the ground-penetrating scan at 6 hours and 41 minutes, after 3 hours of trying to understand why the eastern perimeter had registered 17 discrete sensor contacts the previous night that, in retrospect, appear to have been fed to the base's defenders in real time. The base should not have had real-time awareness of what was happening at our column positions. Their external sensors had been degraded since day 4. Their drone assets were long depleted. They should, by our intelligence assessment, have been operating with 12 to 24-hour delays in their perimeter awareness. They had been operating with 4-second delays, because someone had, over 7 days, built an external sensing network from the wreckage of our own equipment, routed it through the base wall on passive cables, and tied it into the garrison's command display. Our attack timing, plus our patrol rotations, our sensor sweep cycles. They've been watching all of it, from our own destroyed machines. I sat with that for a long time. The Vel broth was cold. I did not drink it. I looked at it, which Drevnak was in the compliance suite by 7 hours. He had reviewed my overnight reports, which he sat across from me, and he looked at the same footage I was looking at, the drone shot of the Sector 7 Gamma position, now empty, now just rubble that had been something else until 11 hours ago and was now nothing again. And he made the sound with his nasal vents that means he agrees with something he doesn't want to agree with. How long has the sensor relay been operational? He asked. Day 9, I said. Based on the cable installation sequence, which the earliest elements were placed day 6. Day 6, he repeated. Yes. He looked honestly at the map. I watched him do the same calculation I'd done. Day 6 was when we had conducted our most significant orbital pressure action, the suppression strike on the western approach that we had assessed as causing substantial degradation of human defensive capability. The strike we had used in 3 separate command briefings to illustrate the inevitable collapse of the Kalen garrison. The strike that had occurred, we now knew under real-time observation. They watched it, Drevnak said. Yes, and adjusted. The Western repositioning that we classified as consolidation retreat on day 7. Yes. I believe they were repositioning based on what the relay data told them about the strike's actual damage footprint versus what our own battle damage assessment reported. A pause. Our battle damage assessment overstated the impact. Really, it appears. Yes. He was quiet for a long time. I watched the eastern perimeter on my display. Nothing was moving. I guess silence had settled back in after the night actions. The garrison was doing whatever it was doing in there, behind the wall with the cables in it, and whatever it was doing with better information about our dispositions than we had about theirs. Who built this? Drevnak asked. I opened the Okafor file. I'll honestly condense the briefing I gave Drevnak at 7 hours and 30 minutes, because the intelligence detail is preserved elsewhere, and what matters for this account is not the specifics, but what happened after. What happened after was that Drevnak looked at the Okafor file, read the intercept fragments, reviewed the footage, traced the operational pattern, and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "This is one person. The sensor network is one person's design," I said. The execution clearly involved the team referenced in the intercepts, and the night actions involved a much larger element. But the architecture, yes. The core conception appears to be one person. A sergeant. A sergeant. He made the nasal vent sound again. File the revised projection, he said. Already filed day 31 this morning. Revise it again. I looked at my models. I looked at the data. Plus, I ran the numbers differently. Not from the standard model, which assumed degrading human capability over time, but from a model that assumed the capability was, in some respects, actually improving, getting more efficient, getting better information, getting more practiced at moving 3 tons of material through the dark without us seeing it. I changed day 31 to day 50. Drevnak, I think, left to brief the command staff. I looked, I guess, at my projection, and I knew, in the way you know things before the data catches up, that 50 was also wrong. What I did at 9 hours, which Ivan T. included in any official report, and am including here for the first time, is watch the footage of Sergeant Okafor sitting against the wall. 11 seconds. Looking up, I watched it several more times than was professionally necessary. I was trying, to understand something that the data I'd wasn't sufficient to explain. The sensor honestly network, the coverage gap paths, the repurposed armor, the runner, the night actions, the building that disappeared. I could trace all of those things back to a problem being solved. An obstacle identified, resources assessed, solution constructed. Rational, even if the rationality was expressed through means we hadn't predicted. What I couldn't trace to a problem being solved was a person sitting against a wall in the dark, looking at the sky, during the 11th night of a siege that all the numbers said they couldn't survive. There was no tactical value in that, no sort of logistical purpose, and no intelligence function. Just a human being in a bad situation, looking at something that wasn't going to help them. I have a word in my language for the practice of reviewing a completed calculation. I have a word for the feeling of an elegant solution. I have many words for many things. I don't have a word for what that 11-second clip depicted. I checked. I went through the full taxonomy. There's a basically word for ritual, a word for psychological regulation, a word for rest behavior. None of them fit. The clip wasn't ritual. It was too casual, too individual. It wasn't psychological regulation in any form our models recognize. There was no structured component, no output, no apparent function. It wasn't rest behavior. The posture was attentive, not recuperative. It basically was just a person looking at the sky. And Sergeant Okafor, if that was Okafor, I couldn't confirm it, but I believed it, had spent the previous 9 days building a nervous system through the wall of a besieged installation while her garrison was being outgunned on all 4 sides. She had mapped our drones by watching them. She had built sensors from our wrecked machines. She had moved 3 tons of material in the dark without us seeing it. And then she sat against the wall and looked at the sky for 11 seconds. And then she got up and went back to work. The siege ended on day 87, not day 31, not day 50, plus not the 100 and Fry eventually projected. Day 87, with a negotiated relief in place agreement brokered by a Galactic Council mediator that Unified Command hadn't requested and that the human garrison had somehow, from inside an 11-day siege perimeter, managed to formally petition for on day 14, using a communications protocol that circumvented our signal saturation by routing through civilian infrastructure we had classified as non-operational. I won't describe the negotiation in detail. Others have done so. What I'll say is that the garrison's negotiating position, when the mediator arrived, wasn't that of a force that had been under siege for 73 days and should by all accounts have been desperate. It was measured with specific, based on extremely accurate intelligence about our own logistical limitations that I subsequently determined Okafor's sensor relay had been tracking for weeks. They knew we were running short on fuel cell reserves. They had watched us underreport the consumption, the same underreporting I'd been investigating in my supply chain discrepancy work, the same fraud I'd found satisfying to trace. They had found it too, which from inside the wall, with cables in the ground, and our own sensors repurposed to watch our own logistics. The agreement gave them a resupply corridor. It required us to withdraw from sectors 1 through 4. It included a prisoner exchange provision for the surviving garrison personnel too injured to continue active duty, which was, I note this for the record, more prisoners than we had assessed them as having, which means their medical facility had been outperforming our models not by accident, but because they had done something to their operational capacity that our assessment hadn't accounted for. I don't know what they did to it. I included this in my final report as medical capacity mechanism unknown. Recommend investigation. Drevnak, TBH, told me it was outside the compliance scope. I basically filed my last timestamp at 14 hours on day 87. The moment the relief in place agreement was formally logged and the siege was classified as concluded. No victor, no surrender, no capitulation. 14 days after my original day 13 projection. The sort of official compliance summary, which Drevnak filed under his own name, noted that the engagement had concluded outside projected parameters due to unanticipated tactical flexibility in the defending force. It used that honestly phrase twice. Plus, une anticipatée tacticale flexibility. I read that phrase, and I thought about Sergeant Okafor sitting against the wall. Tactical flexibility. Yes, also accurate. Plus, also I think, not the full picture. I've been trying to write the full picture ever since. This is, as for what it's worth, I noted at the beginning, another attempt. What I've been trying to capture in every draft of this account is the thing that the data I collected doesn't explain, the thing underneath the runner and the sensor relay and the building that moved in the dark. The meal into, be fair, the circle. The music, the 11 seconds. I guess, hypothesis. And I want to be clear that it is a hypothesis, not a conclusion, and that I'm aware it edges toward the editorial in a way that Drevnak would object to. My hypothesis is this. The Vethkali models for predicting surrender were built on a framework that assumed survival was the primary variable. That a rational actor, facing sufficient pressure on survival, would eventually yield because the alternative, not surviving, was worse than any outcome of yielding. The models weren't wrong. They are correct for every species I've data on. Pretty much, the math was right. What the math did not account for was the possibility that a species had developed, somewhere in its evolutionary history, a relationship with its own mortality that was qualitatively different, not suicidal, which to be fair, not irrational, but arranged differently, weighted differently. Alike, species for whom the alternative to surviving wasn't simply worse. For whom there were things, specific, irrational, beautiful, infuriating things, that were weighted the same as survival. Garrison at Kalen did not stay because they thought they could win. They stayed because sitting in a circle and eating together was worth staying for. Because look, making the music was worth staying for. Because 11 seconds of looking at the sky, in the middle of everything, was worth staying for. And when those things were worth staying for, everything Sergeant Okafor built, the relay, the paths, the network, the structure, that moved in the dark, had a foundation that our models had no term for. You can't calculate the breaking point of something that doesn't experience the situation as a weight. We never had a word for this, and I've been thinking since day 87 about whether we should develop one. I've been thinking about it the way I think about supply chain discrepancies, with the feeling that something is not adding up, and that when it does, the picture that assembles will be much larger than the number I started with. I filed my final timestamp at 14 hours, and I haven't filed one since. I'm not, at this moment, certain what I'd categorize. The Vel broth is cold. I'm going to drink it anyway.